"Mr. Pierce, if you sign that deal tonight, Pierce Global won't make it to Christmas." The words slipped out quietly, but in the polished silence of the 41st floor boardroom, they landed like something heavier than sound, something that didn't belong in a room filled with tailored suits and polished leather chairs, something that certainly didn't belong coming from a woman holding a gray microfiber cloth and a cleaning cart parked beside the glass wall. Jonathan Pierce didn't look up at first. He kept his silver pen hovering above the contract, his expression unchanged, his jaw tight the way it had been for the last 3 weeks as the numbers kept sliding, the headlines kept turning colder, and the investors kept asking questions he no longer had easy answers for. The skyline of downtown Chicago stretched behind him, October clouds drifting low over Lake Michigan, the late evening light reflecting off the glass towers like a muted warning. Around the table, executives shifted slightly, their eyes flicking toward the woman near the wall, unsure whether to ignore her or acknowledge the breach of something unspoken but rigid, the invisible line between those who made decisions and those who cleaned up after them. Ava Richardson stood still, her fingers tightening slightly around the cloth, her pulse audible in her ears, but her posture remained steady, shoulders squared in quiet restraint. She hadn't meant to speak. Not really. Not in a room like this. Not with men and women whose watches cost more than her yearly rent, whose voices carried the calm certainty of people who believed they owned outcomes. But she had seen the numbers on the projection screen, seen the partner name buried in the slide, seen the familiar shell structure she remembered from textbooks she once studied under flickering dorm lights before tuition bills ended that chapter of her life. And something inside her refused to stay silent. Jonathan Pierce finally looked up. His pale blue eyes settled on her, not angry, not yet, just distant, the way someone looks at an unexpected interruption that shouldn't exist. His voice, when he spoke, was calm, measured, and unmistakably cold. "You're here to clean, not to comment." A faint ripple of discomfort moved through the room. Someone cleared their throat. Another executive adjusted his tablet, pretending not to watch. Ava nodded once, respectfully, the way she had learned to move through spaces where she wasn't meant to be noticed, but she didn't step back. The glow from the recessed ceiling lights reflected faintly off the polished marble floor beneath her shoes, the scent of fresh coffee lingering in the air, the quiet hum of the HVAC system filling the silence. She glanced once at the screen, then back at Jonathan. "Sir, the offshore partner tied to that restructuring, they're holding the debt in a separate entity. If you transfer control, they don't just restructure, they absorb your core assets." A few heads lifted. One executive leaned forward slightly. Jonathan's pen remained suspended, unmoving. The CFO, seated 2 chairs down, gave a small, dismissive smile, the kind that suggested amusement more than concern. "I think we're done here," he said lightly, as if the moment had already passed. Ava felt the familiar pressure in her chest, the weight of knowing she had crossed a boundary that rarely forgave people like her, but she didn't retreat. The city lights flickered on beyond the windows, one building after another, the evening settling deeper around the tower. Jonathan Pierce studied her for another second, his expression unreadable, and in that stillness, the entire room seemed to hold its breath, suspended between dismissal and something else, something quieter, something that hadn't yet revealed itself. Jonathan Pierce did not lower the pen, but the air in the boardroom shifted, subtle and almost invisible, like the moment before a storm changes direction over Lake Michigan, and Ava Richardson felt it immediately, the quiet weight of attention pressing toward her from every corner of the long glass table as if the room itself had decided she was no longer invisible. And that alone made her pulse climb faster than she wanted to show, yet she remained still beside her cleaning cart, the wheels slightly angled toward the exit, as though she had planned to leave before this moment ever began. And in truth she had, because for the last 6 months Ava had learned how to move quietly through Pierce Global's headquarters, arriving at 6:30 in the evening, clocking in through the employee entrance on Lower Wacker Drive, riding the service elevator to whichever floor needed attention, and leaving before sunrise when the executives returned to reclaim the polished silence she helped maintain, her world measured in trash bins, glass smudges, and the faint smell of industrial cleaner that clung to her sleeves even after she washed them twice at the laundromat near her apartment on the south side, a small one-bedroom she shared with her grandmother whose medical bills were stacked neatly in a shoebox by the kitchen window, and each night Ava carried those numbers in her head the same way she once carried accounting formulas, balance sheets, and financial models back when she sat in the third row of a community college classroom, believing she would eventually work inside buildings like this instead of quietly maintaining them. But tuition rose, her father passed away unexpectedly, and the scholarships that once seemed within reach disappeared one by one until she folded her textbooks into a cardboard box and told herself she would return someday, though someday kept moving further away, and yet she never stopped reading, never stopped noticing, never stopped glancing at screens left glowing after late meetings or printed documents abandoned near conference rooms, because numbers still made sense to her even when life did not. And earlier that evening she had been wiping down the glass wall outside the executive lounge when she overheard fragments of conversation, the chief financial officer speaking in a low voice about restructuring, offshore allocations, and asset shielding, terms that brushed against her memory like something unfinished. And when she later saw the presentation projected across the boardroom screen, the structure felt familiar, not in a comfortable way, but in the way a warning sign feels familiar after you have studied enough case studies of companies that vanished quietly after signing agreements that promised stability but delivered control to someone else. And now, standing under the recessed lighting of the 41st floor, Ava felt the weight of that recognition pressing against her chest as Jonathan Pierce continued watching her, his expression still reserved, his posture perfectly composed, but his silence stretching longer than expected. And across the table one of the senior partners leaned slightly forward, fingers resting against a leather folder, while another executive glanced at the slide again as if the numbers might rearrange themselves under scrutiny, and the city beyond the windows deepened into night, headlights threading through the streets 40 stories below, the hum of distant traffic faint but steady, and Ava realized she had crossed a line that rarely offered second chances. Yet something steadier than fear kept her voice grounded as she added quietly, "The debt transfer looks temporary, but once the assets shift, your leverage disappears." And for the first time Jonathan Pierce's pen lowered slowly onto the table, not signing, not dismissing, simply resting there as if the decision had paused itself, and the room, once ruled by confidence, settled into a quieter uncertainty that none of them had expected to come from the woman holding a microfiber cloth beside a cart filled with cleaning supplies. The silence that followed did not belong to a cleaning staff member, and that alone unsettled the room more than any raised voice could have, because the 41st floor boardroom was designed for control, for certainty, for decisions measured in millions of dollars and announced with steady confidence. Yet now the quiet felt different, heavier, as Jonathan Pierce leaned back slightly in his chair and folded his hands together, his eyes still fixed on Ava Richardson as if recalibrating how to place her within a world that had always categorized people by titles and access badges. And across from him, Martin Keller, the chief financial officer, gave a soft exhale through his nose, a controlled sound that suggested patience rather than concern, though his fingers tapped once against the edge of his tablet before going still, and the glow from the presentation screen reflected faintly across the polished walnut table, illuminating columns of projected revenue recovery and debt restructuring timelines that had looked reassuring only minutes earlier, while outside the windows the Chicago skyline settled deeper into night, the lake turning dark beyond the grid of streetlights below, and Ava remained standing beside her cart, aware that every second she stayed inside this moment increased the risk of stepping beyond what someone in her position was expected to do. Yet she also remembered the stack of layoffs reported in the news last quarter, the warehouse closures, the families like hers who felt those decisions first, and that memory steadied her voice even as she kept it respectful, measured, and calm. While Jonathan Pierce finally spoke again, his tone quieter than before, no longer dismissive but not yet welcoming, asking, "What makes you certain?" And the question shifted the air again because it acknowledged her presence in a way no one in that room expected, and Ava hesitated only briefly, choosing her words carefully, knowing that one misstep would erase whatever fragile space she had created, and she answered, The partner structure mirrors a consolidation model used when a company wants control without immediate exposure. The assets move first, the liabilities remain behind, and once the transfer completes, the leverage disappears. And a senior partner at the far end of the table leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowing at the screen as if reconsidering the slide he had already approved, while Martin Keller gave a small, polite smile that did not quite reach his eyes and said, "With respect, we have an entire advisory team that reviewed this." And his tone carried the gentle weight of authority, the suggestion that expertise belonged to credentials rather than observation. Yet Jonathan Pierce did not immediately respond, instead glancing briefly at the numbers again, and Ava noticed the subtle tightening at the corner of his jaw, the first visible sign that something in her words had landed deeper than he intended to show, and the quiet hum of the room returned, the air conditioning whispering softly above them, the faint scent of coffee and polished wood lingering, and Ava felt the moment stretching, uncertain and fragile, like standing on the edge of a decision that had not yet chosen its direction, while Jonathan Pierce reached forward and slowly rotated the screen toward himself, his pen resting beside the contract rather than hovering above it, and for the first time since she entered the room, Ava sensed that the outcome of the night was no longer moving forward with the same certainty, and the executives exchanged subtle glances, the confidence that filled the room earlier now softened by a quiet, unspoken question, and Ava stood still beneath the ceiling lights, aware that whatever happened next would define whether her voice had crossed a boundary or revealed something no one else had noticed. Jonathan Pierce's gaze remained on the screen, but the stillness around him sharpened, the kind that spread quietly when control began slipping from certainty into calculation, and Ava Richardson sensed it in the subtle movements around the table, a senior analyst scrolling back through earlier slides, another executive leaning closer to the printed packet as if the numbers might reveal something they had overlooked. While Martin Keller's polite smile faded into a more measured expression, his posture straightening slightly as he adjusted his cufflinks with deliberate calm, the gesture small but controlled, like someone reinforcing confidence before uncertainty could take root, and the city lights outside the glass wall reflected across the polished table, forming faint streaks of white and gold that stretched between the executives like silent dividing lines, and Jonathan finally reached for the remote, clicking back 2 slides. The screen shifting to a breakdown of projected asset transfers and offshore allocations, and the faint click echoed louder than expected in the quiet room, while Ava remained still beside her cart, her hands resting lightly on the handle, her heartbeat steadying now that the moment had passed beyond fear and into something quieter, something rooted in clarity rather than impulse. And Jonathan's voice came again, calm but edged with focus. "Which entity?" And Ava answered carefully, stepping only half a pace forward, respectful of the space she occupied. "The holding company listed under North Harbor Capital. It looks separate, but the ownership trail connects through layered subsidiaries." And one of the senior partners leaned forward sharply, glancing toward Martin Keller, whose expression remained composed though his fingers paused briefly against his tablet screen, and Jonathan clicked again, zooming into the slide, his eyes scanning the structure while the room leaned into silence, the hum of the ventilation system filling the background like distant wind, and after a few seconds, Jonathan spoke without looking up. "Our advisors reviewed this." And Ava nodded gently, her tone still careful. "Yes, sir, but the leverage disappears after the transfer period, once the operational control shifts." And another executive turned slightly in his chair, studying the numbers more closely, while someone at the far end of the table murmured quietly, almost to themselves, "That would shift voting power." And the words seemed to ripple across the room, subtle but undeniable, and Martin Keller finally leaned forward, his voice measured, professional. "Jonathan, we have contingency protections built in. This structure has been vetted." Yet his tone carried a faint tightness now, a small shift that Ava noticed even as she kept her gaze lowered respectfully, and Jonathan did not respond immediately, instead lifting the printed contract from the table and flipping to the appendix, the pages whispering softly as they turned, and the executives watched, their earlier confidence replaced by cautious attention, while Ava felt the weight of the moment settle deeper, aware that she had already crossed beyond invisibility, and Jonathan paused on a page, scanning carefully, the faint glow from the overhead lights reflecting off the paper. And after a long second, his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and he asked, quietly, "Where did you learn this?" And Ava hesitated, then answered honestly, "I studied accounting before I started working nights." And the room shifted again, the answer simple but unexpected, and Jonathan looked up at her fully for the first time, his expression no longer distant but searching, and the silence that followed felt different now, no longer dismissive but cautious, as if the room itself had begun reconsidering who was standing beside the cleaning cart, and why her voice carried more weight than anyone had anticipated. The room did not return to its earlier confidence, and that absence of certainty spread slowly, like the dimming of lights across the skyline outside, as Jonathan Pierce kept his attention on the contract pages resting beneath his hands, his posture composed yet noticeably more deliberate, while Ava Richardson stood quietly beside her cart, aware that every second she remained part of the conversation made the tension sharper. Not louder, but more precise, and Martin Keller shifted in his chair. Leaning forward with a calm that felt carefully constructed, his voice measured as he addressed Jonathan directly. "We have reviewed the ownership trail, the safeguards are in place, the transition window protects operational continuity." And his tone carried the smooth assurance of someone accustomed to guiding decisions without resistance, yet Jonathan did not immediately nod, instead flipping another page, his eyes scanning the footnotes and ownership disclosures, the faint rustle of paper cutting through the silence, while one of the senior partners tapped lightly on his tablet, pulling up the offshore registry referenced in the appendix, and the glow from the screen reflected faintly across his glasses as he leaned closer, and Ava felt the weight of the moment deepen, her hands resting still on the handle of the cart, her shoulders steady, her breathing slow, as though she had stepped into a space she had never expected to occupy yet could not step away from now. And Jonathan finally spoke again, his tone neutral but edged with inquiry. "How confident are you?" And Ava answered carefully, "Confident enough to ask you to pause before signing." And the words settled quietly in the room, not confrontational, not dramatic, but firm in a way that made several executives glance at one another, their expressions shifting from skepticism to cautious curiosity, while Martin Keller offered a small, controlled smile. "Jonathan, with respect, we cannot delay indefinitely, the markets open in the morning." And his voice remained calm, yet the faint tightening around his eyes suggested the pressure beneath his composure, and Jonathan leaned back slightly, his gaze moving from the contract to the screen again, and the city lights reflected faintly across his expression, making the room feel suspended between decision and hesitation, and Ava sensed that the outcome balanced on something fragile, something quieter than authority, and across the table the senior analyst finally spoke, his voice low. "There is an ownership overlap here." And the words seemed to settle like a quiet ripple, and Martin Keller turned toward him, his posture still composed. "It is a temporary consolidation structure." But Jonathan did not immediately accept the explanation, instead glancing again at the appendix, his pen still resting beside the unsigned line, and Ava felt the stillness deepen, the hum of the ventilation system steady above them, the faint reflection of moving headlights far below drifting across the glass wall, and Jonathan finally placed his palm lightly over the contract, not signing, not closing, simply holding it in place as if grounding the moment, and the room fell completely silent, every executive watching, every breath measured, while Ava remained still beneath the overhead lights, aware that the decision had not yet been made but that the certainty that once filled the room had quietly dissolved, replaced by a cautious awareness that something important had shifted and that the voice no one expected to matter had begun to change the direction of the night. Jonathan Pierce did not move his hand from the contract, and the stillness that followed felt heavier than any argument, as if the entire 41st floor had paused with him, the glow of Chicago's night skyline stretching across the glass wall while the room settled into a quiet tension that no one seemed willing to break, and Ava Richardson felt the shift not in words but in silence, the kind that arrives when certainty begins to fracture. When people who were confident only minutes ago begin searching for something they had not expected to question, and one by one the executives lowered their eyes back to their screens, the faint tapping of keyboards returning, subdued and cautious, while the senior analyst leaned forward, scrolling through ownership records, his brow tightening slightly as he followed the layered structure across multiple entities. And the air conditioning hummed steadily above them, the soft mechanical rhythm filling the silence like distant wind, and Ava remained beside her cart, aware that her role in the moment had reached its limit, that she had said what she could without stepping further beyond the boundaries she had already crossed, and slowly, carefully, she shifted her grip on the cart handle, not to leave abruptly but to ease back into the quiet presence she had occupied before, her movements small and respectful. The wheels rolling a few inches across the polished marble floor, barely making a sound, and Jonathan noticed, his eyes flicking briefly toward her before returning to the documents, and that brief glance carried something different now, not dismissal, not authority, but consideration, and Ava turned slightly toward the glass wall as if checking for smudges, giving the room space to continue without her voice, the city lights reflecting faintly across the surface as she wiped gently. The cloth moving in slow circles, her breathing steady, her thoughts quiet but heavy, because she understood how fragile moments like this were, how easily they could dissolve, how quickly people could return to comfort once doubt faded, and across the table Martin Keller maintained his composed posture, though the faint tension in his shoulders suggested the strain beneath his calm, his fingers resting still on the tablet as he watched Jonathan review the appendix again, and the senior analyst finally spoke softly, almost cautiously, pointing to the screen. "There is a secondary ownership link here." And Jonathan leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing as he studied the connection, the faint reflection of the screen glowing across his face, and the room leaned into silence. Again, the weight of uncertainty settling deeper, while Ava continued wiping the glass, the motions slow and methodical, her reflection faint beside the city lights, and for a moment she remembered her father telling her that numbers always told the truth if you looked long enough, that patience revealed what confidence overlooked, and she felt that lesson settle quietly within her as Jonathan turned another page, his pen still resting untouched, and the clock on the wall ticked softly, marking seconds that felt longer than usual, while the executives exchanged subtle glances, their earlier certainty replaced by cautious awareness, and Jonathan finally set the contract flat on the table, not closing it, not signing, simply leaving it there as if allowing the room to breathe. And the silence that followed was calm but charged, the kind that arrives when something important has shifted. When a decision once considered inevitable becomes uncertain, and Ava finished wiping the glass and stepped back slightly, her card beside her, her posture quiet and composed, aware that she had already changed the direction of the night without raising her voice, without demanding attention, simply by speaking when it mattered, and the city lights beyond the glass seemed brighter now, reflecting across the room as if the skyline itself had paused to witness the moment where certainty gave way to caution and the quietest voice in the room had begun to reshape the outcome. The senior analyst's voice remained low but carried clearly across the polished table as he rotated his screen toward Jonathan Pierce, the faint glow illuminating a nested ownership chart that extended deeper than the earlier slides had shown, and Jonathan leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he traced the connections line by line. The silence in the room tightening as if every executive sensed that the moment had shifted beyond speculation into something more concrete, while Martin Keller straightened slightly in his chair, his calm posture still intact yet his fingers now clasped together rather than resting loosely, and the city lights beyond the glass wall flickered against the dark surface of Lake Michigan, the reflection stretching across the boardroom windows like a quiet reminder of how far the consequences of a single decision could reach. And Jonathan spoke softly, not looking away from the screen. "Expand that layer." And the analyst complied, opening another tier of subsidiaries, revealing a holding structure that looped back toward North Harbor Capital, and a faint murmur moved across the table as one of the partners leaned closer, scanning the names carefully, while Ava Richardson remained near the glass wall, her cloth resting lightly in her hand. Her attention focused. The expanded ownership chart filled the screen with a layered network of subsidiaries, each line tracing quietly back toward North Harbor Capital, and the room fell into a deeper silence as Jonathan Pierce studied the connections one by one, his expression tightening slightly while the faint glow from the screen reflected across his face. And the senior analyst scrolled further, revealing overlapping board members and shared management entities, the pattern becoming clearer with every additional layer, while one of the senior partners leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. They would gain operational leverage within 90 days. And the words settled heavily across the table, causing several executives to shift in their seats, their earlier confidence replaced by measured concern, and Martin Keller's posture remained composed, yet the subtle tension in his shoulders became more visible as he adjusted his tablet and spoke carefully. These structures are common in transitional financing. But Jonathan did not immediately respond, instead glancing back to the contract, flipping to another appendix, his fingers moving slowly as if verifying each detail, and Ava Richardson remained near the glass wall, her presence quiet yet no longer unnoticed, the reflection of city lights faint across her uniform as she stood still, aware that the moment had reached a point where the outcome no longer depended on her voice but on the truth unfolding before them, and the analyst spoke again, pointing to a highlighted section. If control shifts here, voting rights consolidate under the holding entity. And Jonathan's jaw tightened slightly as he followed the line with his finger, the silence deepening until the only sound was the low hum of the ventilation system and the distant murmur of traffic far below, and after a long second Jonathan leaned back slowly, his gaze moving across the table, meeting each executive's eyes in turn before finally settling briefly on Ava, and there was something different in that glance now. Not authority, not dismissal, but recognition, and he turned back to the contract, lifting the pen once more before pausing again, and then he set the pen down firmly beside the paper, the gesture small but decisive, and the room seemed to exhale quietly, uncertainty replaced by cautious clarity, while Jonathan spoke in a calm, measured tone. We are not signing tonight. And the words carried across the table with quiet authority, prompting subtle nods from several executives while others leaned back slightly, their expressions reflecting relief mixed with realization, and Martin Keller remained still, his expression neutral though the tension in his posture did not fully ease, and Jonathan closed the folder gently, his hand resting on top of it as if sealing the decision, and Ava felt the shift settle through the room, the weight of what had almost happened becoming clearer with each passing second, and as Jonathan stood slowly, the skyline behind him glowed softly against the night, the lights reflecting across the glass walls while the executives began gathering their documents in subdued silence, and Ava stepped back slightly, her card beside her, her posture calm, knowing she had spoken when it mattered, and as Jonathan turned toward the exit he paused briefly, glancing once more in her direction, the quiet acknowledgment lingering for a moment before he moved forward, leaving behind a room that no longer felt certain but instead felt grounded by a decision shaped by a voice no one had expected to change the course of the night. The boardroom slowly emptied, one quiet movement at a time, executives gathering leather folders, tablets dimming, chairs sliding softly across polished marble as the weight of the decision settled into something calmer, something reflective, and Jonathan Pierce remained standing near the end of the long table, his gaze fixed on the city beyond the glass wall where Chicago stretched into the distance, the grid of headlights flowing like slow rivers beneath the dark sky, while Ava Richardson gently rolled her cart toward the far corner, her movements quiet and deliberate, returning to the rhythm she understood. The simple motion of wiping a surface, aligning a chair, restoring order to a room that had just shifted in ways no one would speak about directly, and the faint hum of the building filled the silence, the sound of elevators traveling between floors, the distant echo of a door closing somewhere down the hall, and Jonathan remained still for another moment before turning back toward the table, his hand resting briefly on the closed contract as if acknowledging the narrow distance between decision and consequence. And then he looked toward Ava, who had begun wiping the glass wall again, her reflection blending with the lights outside, and he walked slowly across the room, his footsteps soft but measured, and Ava noticed his approach, pausing respectfully, her hands still, her posture calm, and Jonathan stopped a few feet away, the distance respectful, his voice quieter than it had been earlier. You saw something none of us did. And Ava lowered her eyes slightly, not out of uncertainty but out of humility, her voice gentle. "I just noticed the pattern, sir." And Jonathan nodded once, the acknowledgment small but sincere, and the moment lingered without formality, without ceremony, just two people standing beneath soft ceiling lights while the city moved quietly beyond them, and after a second Jonathan spoke again. "What is your name?" And she answered, "Ava Richardson." And he repeated it softly, as if committing it to memory, and the faintest shift passed across his expression, something reflective, something grounded, and then he gave a small nod. Stepping back, allowing the silence to settle naturally, and Ava resumed her work, the cloth moving slowly across the glass while Jonathan walked toward the exit, pausing once at the doorway, glancing back at the room now calm and quiet, and beyond the glass wall the first hint of early morning gray touched the horizon over Lake Michigan, the night slowly easing into dawn, and Ava finished wiping the last panel, stepping back to check the reflection, the skyline now softer, calmer, and she gently rolled her cart toward the service hallway, her footsteps light, her presence returning to quiet invisibility, yet something had changed. Not in the room, not in the city, but in the stillness that followed. And as the elevator doors closed behind her, the faint glow of morning filled the corridor, leaving the 41st floor calm and silent, the contract unsigned, the decision made, and the quiet imprint of a voice that had reshaped the night lingering like the first light of dawn across the glass.